I'm Peter Andreas from the Watts Institute and the Political Science Department. I run the security seminar series here at the Institute, and it's my great pleasure to bring to Brown and the Watts Institute Austin Carson, assistant professor from political science at the University of Chicago. This is the second time we've tried to bring him this semester. The first time, he's from Chicago, but the first time he got snowed out on our end. And now I guess there's a storm coming. He might get snowed in on his return to Chicago. And again, it's snow on our end. So, and it's awfully windy here, like Chicago as well. So anyway, you're here. Hopefully we won't keep you longer than your scheduled visit. He will be speaking to us today on his book project on Hidden in Plain Sight, Escalation Control and the Covert Side of the Vietnam War. Remember the Vietnam War? Highly relevant, actually, in many ways to today. And if you're really enthused by the talk, there's also a downloadable paper if you want more details on the Watson website. So we also, I know, talking from Austin earlier this afternoon, we also share a great interest in Erving Goffman, which is not a super central figure in international relations or even political science, but highly recommended reading a sociology theorist, which has been relevant to some of my previous work, and I was thrilled to discover that Austin makes it part of his framing for this current project. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Austin Carson.
All right, well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks, Peter, to you and the Watson Institute for bringing me in. I'm excited to have finally made it, and hopefully I will get to escape as well. And thanks to Ellen White for handling all the logistics, especially given the challenges that the snow threw in our way. And what I'm presenting here, as Peter said, is part of a larger book project, which is on overall the relationship between secrecy and limited war. And one piece of that book project looked at the way a different war, the Korean War, and the way the United States and Soviet Union, in a kind of tacit way, effectively kept secret the degree to which they were in direct combat in the skies over Korea during the Korean War. And this, what I'm presenting today, is sort of a companion piece to that. And instead of looking at the way states effectively keep secrets and manage escalation problems through that mechanism, this paper looks at ineffective secrecy, basically secrets that get leaked, and leaked a lot. And that results in state activity during wartime that is essentially hidden in plain sight. And so that's what we're going to look at today empirically is an aspect of the Vietnam War, American covert operations in Laos, which over time were leaked about so systematically and so regularly that anyone who cared to look, a member of the public or certainly leaders of other states, were aware of what the U.S. was doing in actually quite a bit of detail. So the reason I think, part of the reason I think this is interesting is obviously its relevance today. The Trump administration in just 2 months has gotten a crash course in just how endemic leaking is in a foreign policy, in the foreign policy domain of a democracy. They are a fact of life. They're driven by a range of motives. They have a lot of different effects, but we don't actually know that as scholars. In international relations, the research on leaks and that part of secrecy is even less developed than the research on secrecy itself. So this paper tries to take that topic head on. So I want to kind of get at this to start with 2 examples of leaks. This first example is front page of the New York Times, 1970, July, which was basically the article that broke the news that the United States intelligence community believed the Israeli government had developed a functional nuclear weapon. And this article was followed periodically over a series of years in the 70s and the 80s by other mainstream media publications which indicated that the Israeli government had an increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons capability. And interestingly, the Israeli government to this day does not acknowledge its status as a nuclear weapons state. And yet this repeated leaking about its arsenal has made it, according to sort of the foremost expert on Israel's nuclear arsenal, one of the worst kept secrets in international politics. And it is what I'll be calling in this paper, in this talk, an open secret, an example of that. Very similar, 2009, New York Times, again, breaks a story about American covert action inside Pakistan. The covert drone strike program that was publicly acknowledged, those strikes that took place in Afghanistan, but those that took place in Pakistan were a different matter entirely. But the New York Times, Washington Post, and a number of other outlets were publishing fairly regularly very detailed accounts of the nature of the American drone strike program inside Pakistan. And again, for years, both under Bush and the Obama administrations, the U.S. Refused to admit what it was doing. It ritualistically did not acknowledge, did not confirm the reports that the U.S. was engaging in lethal strikes using drones inside Pakistan. So again, it's a kind of example of a poorly kept secret, and one which the government engaging in that secret activity did not admit and did not acknowledge in the aftermath of that exposure. What I think is interesting about these is not so much the reason these get exposed, and that's not really what I'm going to be talking about today, is why those leaks take place, but rather what governments do in the aftermath of those leaks. So the focus of the paper and the talk is on what I'm calling the politics of open secrets. So open secrets, as I define them in the paper, are concealed decisions or state behavior that have been exposed to the widest set of observers and with substantial detail, but without official acknowledgement. And that, I think, fairly characterizes the Israeli nuclear program, as well as the American drone program in Pakistan for at least about 5 or 7 years. And what I think I want to ask the question in the paper and in the talk today is why are open secrets still politically useful? Okay, why does keeping this covert posture, refusing to admit what everybody can see, why is it something that governments do and actually put a lot of effort into doing? And my answer is going to have to do with sort of the political and communicative aspects of escalation, of wartime escalation dynamics. So it fits pretty well with the other story I've told about the Korean War, but involves this alternative scenario in which secret activity is widely exposed. All right, so why bother looking at all this? Why does it matter? A few reasons. Number one, I think it's a genuinely puzzling phenomenon. Why either social actors, in the case of everyday life, or in international politics, why there's a sort of ritualistic desire to, and practice which allows you to not acknowledge what everybody can see. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And the reason why it's genuinely puzzling is because open secrets can't trick anyone. By definition, it's been widely exposed. So people know the content of what governments are doing covertly or secretly in these scenarios. And because our sort of intuitive logics and the scholarship in IR associate secrecy with the effect it has on what people know, when everybody knows what you're doing, it doesn't seem to be very useful. So why is that something that remains useful to leaders? I think it's also obviously relevant to contemporary policy challenges. Leaks, if anything, are becoming more endemic, more common. We have an administration in the White House right now, the Trump administration, which seems particularly comfortable with alternative facts or narratives which don't kind of line up with what's being reported or leaked. So understanding why that might actually have a longer historical lineage than the current White House is useful, and understanding how leaders react to leaks, I think, is something that's very useful at this point. And there's also new examples of these kinds of open secret type behaviors where, for example, the Russians have been involved militarily with their personnel and weaponry in supporting rebels in eastern Ukraine. That's been documented through a variety of means, photographs, leaks about intelligence assessments, and other means. And the Russian government has continuously said that these are not actually Russian military personnel, they're volunteers, and have refused to admit what their involvement is in that context. Lastly, I think there's interesting normative implications of this as well. Secrecy is this kind of this difficult component of democracy in the sense that it allows potential abuses and undermines the ability for publics and other branches of government to exercise democratic accountability. Leaks have been talked about by some political theorists as a solution to this problem. Basically, if you have leaks, you can periodically, if there are abuses of secrecy, be made aware as the public or members of Congress of those abuses. And so understanding how people and how governments react to leaks, I think, is part of understanding what role secrecy and leaks have in democratic accountability. So for the rest of the talk, I want to briefly sketch the nature of existing work in international relations scholarship on secrecy and what it says or does not say about this specific phenomenon of open secrecy. Theoretically, I want to put down some of the nuts and bolts in terms of linking open secrecy and the process of what I call acknowledgement with escalation dynamics. I'll talk a bit about the empirical case that I look at, the Vietnam covert operations in Laos case, and why I think that that's a particularly useful one to explore, summarize some of the key findings, present some of the evidence from the archives that I've come across, and then talk about implications. Okay, so to begin to understand, I think, what open secrecy involves and what's going on politically with it, we have to understand what scholars have said about why states are drawn to manipulating what others see about them, so understanding secrecy in IR literature. And there's basically two flavors of theories. One of them explains secrecy as a useful tool to insecure states who have to protect themselves in an anarchic international environment. And so manipulating information, what, say, the adversary knows about your military capabilities, or during war, about where your military assets are located, or concrete military operations, those are really important to defending oneself and engaging in effective sort of military strategic policy. Captured in phrases like incentives to misrepresent in the scholarly literature by folks like Jim Fearon, and wartime phrases like loose lips sink ships. And here the logic for secrecy is really targeting the adversary, and the purpose of it is for a sort of national security self-protection. The second flavor of scholarly work on secrecy looks rather, instead of between states and adversaries, in that sort of context, looks domestically. It looks at particular leaders in their desire to hold on to power and do what they want to do in terms of policy activity. And so secrecy can be appealing to a leader as a way to loosen domestic constraints, particularly democratic leaders. A classic example being Nixon in the latter years of Vietnam, which I'm not going to talk much about actually today, where secrecy was useful for Nixon and Kissinger to adopt a series of actions that expanded what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam and minimized or sought to avoid too much outcry from anti-war activists at the time. So there's a variety of variations on this theme, but basically looking at domestic politics and the relationship between a leader and their potential critics is another way to look at what states are doing with secrecy. And even though these two flavors of theoretical approaches to secrecy have important differences in terms of who's being targeted, somebody abroad, somebody domestically, what the goal is, there's a shared theme that's very important for this paper and this phenomenon, I think, which is that both of these assume or think that secrecy is having an effect on the distribution of knowledge. That when states use secrecy, what they're trying to do is keep knowledge about something from someone, from an adversary to protect themselves, or from a domestic critic to protect their own political viability or policy programs. So I think given we're looking at situations in particular in open secrecy where it's hard to make the case that there is an effect on the distribution of knowledge when exposure has happened repeatedly and with sufficient detail, then I think that's one of the important shortcomings we have in the existing ways we approach secrecy, is understanding something other than distribution of knowledge that acting covertly or secretly might do. So that's hopefully what I'll be able to convince you of today. The other thing that the existing literature shares is a tendency to treat what governments choose, what the options governments are choosing between, as one or the other. Either you do something publicly or you do something secretly or privately. When in fact I think it's more descriptively accurate to think about those two endpoints being on two opposite ends of a spectrum. And once you sort of think about, what happens when a leak happens? Well, there's actually different things that can result when a leak about a secret activity or a secret program or a secret decision happens. It may expose very few details up to and including the complete amount of details regarding what a country has done or a government has done. So there's variation in the degree of detail that's exposed, and then there's variation in who sees what's been exposed. So in some of my other work, I look at situations when the only observers that really understand and know what's going on secretly are other governments with very good intelligence capabilities. And that was the case in the Korean War, where the US knew what the Soviets were doing covertly because the US had very sophisticated intelligence capabilities. But to the average Joe, even somebody in East Asia, in Japan, or in Korea, it wasn't clear who was flying the planes. But the US knew. Now, when it gets exposed on the front page of the New York Times, it's a different matter entirely. Now you have both publics and governments and anyone who picks up a newspaper that knows the content of what's being done covertly. So you get different combinations depending on how detailed and how widely exposed it is in terms of observer groups. But the core, I guess the core thing to keep in mind is that up here in the upper right, is where I think open secrets lay. As I define them, they involve exposure of a substantial amount, maybe not every single detail, but a lot of the details, to as many possible observers as there are. And so I think that's when you talk about an Israeli nuclear program or the Pakistani or the US drone program in Pakistan, they are instances where the degree of exposure places them in that sort of upper right box. All right, so in order to make sense of what's going on with the politics of open secrecy, I think it's important to draw a distinction between two things, knowledge and acknowledgement. And I think what that does is it unlocks an insight into what secrecy allows states to do beyond just manipulate who knows what. So to begin, in terms of the basic conceptual difference between knowledge and acknowledgement, I think it's captured pretty well by a fable that most of us or all of us heard when we were little kids, or at least in middle school, which is the Emperor's New Clothes fable, attributed to Hans Christian Andersen. And in that fable, to dust off the memory, the emperor is told that he has been woven a new set of sort of imperial robes. And he engages in a imperial procession before all the townspeople over whom he rules. And in actuality, he's wearing nothing other than basically his very fancy imperial underwear. And the weavers don't tell him that, and he sees himself without his clothes on, but he sort of chooses to believe and pretend as if he has these new robes on. And importantly, all those who he walks before in the imperial procession, the townspeople, they all can see that he isn't wearing anything new, but none of them acknowledge that fact. And what I think this illustrates is that there's an important difference between knowledge, which is possession of information, and the question being who knows what, and acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is a positive act of admitting the validity of a factual claim. So everyday example is I'm late for a doctor's appointment. Doesn't happen very often, but it might happen. I can go to that doctor's appointment, and we can both know that I was late for that doctor's appointment. But there's a difference between that and us saying it out loud to one another, saying, yes, you were late for the appointment. Maybe you would apologize if you acknowledge you're being late. But it's also possible that both of you don't acknowledge it. And that's a pretty trivial example. It doesn't matter necessarily to your doctor's experience whether acknowledgement happens. But on the next slide, I'll talk about some examples where I think from everyday life there actually is a difference between whether we positively admit the validity of something versus we know it. And the bigger point for, I think, international politics and studying secrecy is that when governments act secretly, they are both affecting potentially who knows what, and now they have knowledge effects, and they also have an acknowledgement effect. That is, they avoid engaging in state behavior that is actually acknowledged rather than one that is not acknowledged. And I'm not sort of making that up. There's actually, in the statutory definition of covert action in the US, it stipulates that covert action, the US engages in covert action when it does something where its role is neither apparent nor acknowledged by the US government officially. So that's part of the reason I started putting this together is looking at that definition. So open secrets, I think, describe scenarios in which there's widespread knowledge about an activity which began secret, and there's also, at the same time, no acknowledgement by the government. So that's what I think I'm interested in talking about in the paper. Okay, so why does acknowledgement matter beyond what people know? Okay, there's a few, I think, examples from everyday social life that I've drawn on some research from outside political science to get some ideas about this. And I think two of the more interesting ones are a study from the late 60s originally, and it's been built on by sociologists studying the death and dying process. But Glaser and Strauss in the late 60s studied how people acted in hospital settings when there was a patient whose family members were around and the patient had a terminal illness. And essentially they noticed that there was a difference between whether or not the hospital staff, the family, and the patient themselves acknowledged and admitted and talked about the terminal illness, and whether or not they knew it. All of them knew the situation but didn't talk about it and actually pretended quite the opposite, that this wasn't the last week or the last hours or the last days of the life of that patient. And what they essentially introduce is this distinction between knowledge and acknowledgement, that it's oftentimes the case that the hospital staff and the family members all knew that there was a terminal illness at hand. They knew, each other knew, but only when they admitted it and talked about it out loud, or when the patient talked about it themselves, did they start to switch how they treated one another, the social roles that were involved, the language that they used, and even some of the legal implications. It can have legal implications in terms of end-of-life decisions, whether or not that dying process has begun. The other, maybe even more intuitive example is sexual orientation and the closet. The closet is a concept that we talk about pretty commonly, and that is essentially a situation where someone who has a sort of minority sexual orientation but does not themselves admit it or is not publicly acknowledged can still operate and embody that sexual orientation. And family members, coworkers, other people in their social circles can know that as well. But the process of admitting and publicly talking about it is, the coming out of the closet process. And so theorists and sociologists have looked at the emotional effects that that can have, the social relationship changes that can trigger. And I think it all points to this difference between knowing the reality of someone's sexual orientation and acknowledging it, and the way that can be a ritualistic process, something that has implications in a variety of ways. So in these contexts, I think the kinds of acknowledgement effects that you can see in these specific situations are impacts that acknowledgement can have on social identity and social roles, on the nature of relationships, on the relevant social and even legal rules. For example, sexual orientation discrimination questions become much more serious and legally plausible in a situation where someone's sexual orientation is acknowledged, even if people know about that sexual orientation but don't acknowledge it. And then something that I kind of call the felt need to respond, sort of the need to behave in certain ways or respond to a reality, I think is sharpened when acknowledgement takes place. Okay, so what does this have to do with international politics? Part of the goal of the paper is to then take some of these ideas and adapt them to the particular issue of states acting secretly and what they're doing becoming exposed, and the difference between acknowledging and not acknowledging that. So the basic idea, I link this process to conflict escalation dynamics. Escalation being defined as the scope and scale of a conflict. Geographically, how big is it? What kind of weapons are used? What kind of targets are selected by the combatants? And I look at it in particular in military intervention scenarios where governments from outside the specific conflict are getting involved. And anytime that happens, there's a risk of escalation because of an action-reaction spiral. And I think acknowledgement is related to that spiral process. So in the paper, I outlined two basic escalation problems. And these are not the only reason war escalates, but there are two reasons that I think that war can escalate. And one of the escalation problems leaders struggle with in these intervention scenarios is that political constraints can make it harder to avoid these action-reaction spirals. That is, if you yourself as a leader have a domestic public that doesn't want you to be humiliated, that wants you to defend your government's interests in a region and your government's reputation, you will find it harder to not take the next step in that action-reaction cycle. And the same thing goes for your adversary. If your adversary has constraints domestically, let's say, it makes it very difficult for them to not take their own step in the action-reaction cycle. And so the outside audience reactions, oftentimes at the sort of mass level, are things that affect the political costliness of acting in a restrained, limited way, and the political rewards for acting in a way that steps a conflict up to the next level. The other escalation problem that I talk about in the paper and develop a little bit is this idea that avoiding unwanted or unintended or really harmful forms of military escalation during war requires adversaries understand one another, basically has a value for keeping things limited and contained. This is not my idea. This was developed all the way back by Thomas Schelling in the 60s, that essentially if the US and the Soviets were going to avoid going to full-scale nuclear war with one another, they need to figure out a way to communicate to one another in concrete situations that we are interested in keeping this contained. And so he talked about different ways to do that, but the key concept he came up with was this idea that salient thresholds that emerge during the conflict can be used to communicate to one another. So basically you got a mountain ridge, and if you don't use force beyond that mountain ridge, the adversary says, oh, okay, they could just go right beyond that mountain ridge if they wanted to, but they for some reason think that mountain ridge is something that's like a kind of border or a kind of marker to delimit or contain the conflict. So when you go up to that but don't exceed it, that's a way to communicate limited war. When you do exceed it, that's a way to show that you're okay with the war escalating in a certain way. Okay, so I take those two basic escalation problems, and I think acknowledgement has some solutions to those escalation problems. So in a situation where secrets have been exposed, but a government does not acknowledge what has been exposed, I think that leaving that exposed activity unacknowledged is a way to save face yourself and a way for your adversary to save face. And it reduces the felt need to respond especially on the part of the adversary. So when I talk about this in the case, what I'll show is there's evidence that I have pretty solid evidence from the archives that indicates that the U.S. believed that if it admitted what it was doing in Laos, that would affect the degree to which the Soviets felt they had to do something in reaction to it. And there was actually direct communication where Soviet representatives said, hey, can you tone down what you're doing in Laos? Because the louder you are about what you do in Laos, the more we feel we have to respond. And at least American leaders believed their acknowledgement of what they were doing when it was exposed in the mainstream media had an effect on whether or not the Soviets felt they had the political space to not respond. The other escalation problem is this communication issue, the salient thresholds. And what I argue here is that the acknowledgement or not acknowledgement of an exposed secret can itself become a kind of salient threshold. And I think the most intuitive example of this is Israel and its nuclear arsenal. That the Israeli government's response to not acknowledge what had been exposed as early as 1970, but again, through subsequent news reports, it has become something of a thing. Israeli non-disclosure is a thing. And Arab governments know that. Arab governments are well aware, and they were aware at the beginning of the policy, and they continue to be aware. And they have started, at least analysts of the Israeli program, a lot of them think that the Israeli government's lack of acknowledgement of its program is seen as essentially a gesture by the Israeli government to not rub nuclear asymmetry in the faces of Arab governments. Say, we've got nuclear weapons, you don't. If they don't talk about it in public, they think that that reduces the degree to which the Arab governments feel pressure. That's the first thing. But the fact that they haven't done it becomes a kind of salient diplomatic threshold. And so that can kind of express a form of restraint, I think. So I'll try to show evidence that along these lines in the case as well. All right, so to circle back to what my question was, why are open secrets politically useful? Why do governments think that this lack of acknowledgement is politically meaningful or helpful, even when everyone knows what they're doing? And my answer was escalation control, but specifically, I think refusing to acknowledge what states are doing in these situations, even though it's been exposed, helps save face, especially for the adversary, and communicate an interest in avoiding escalation and limiting war, both of which help deal with escalation problems. And that explains why a covert posture that you'll see the U.S. maintained for years, despite having widespread exposure for its covert programs in Laos, continues to be useful even though it has been leaked. Okay, so like I said, I look at this in the case of the Vietnam War, in particular American covert operations in Laos. There's a couple of things to think about in terms of the research design that I think the theory that I've developed has implications for. So number one, when we go and look at a concrete case of one of these open secrets, if my story about acknowledgement having a separate effect from knowledge and that separate effect has to do with escalation dynamics, if that's right, we should essentially see two things. That leaders should recognize or discuss or be aware of an independent impact of their acknowledgement of what's been exposed in a leak. And secondly, that those leaders should specifically link that acknowledgement issue to basically escalation scenarios that are relevant in that particular conflict. So that's the kind of evidence I looked for when I went and read some of the internal documents from the American management of the covert operations in Laos. And the argument that I'm trying to build here is falsified or is cast doubt on if neither of those two things hold. If leaders essentially say, it's been leaked, but lots of people don't know, even though it was leaked. That would be evidence that acknowledgement wasn't doing much work. It was more knowledge, residual sort of knowledge effects. Similarly, if they link acknowledgement and they say, oh yeah, this has a separate effect, we got to think about this in a distinct way, but they link it to things other than these escalation scenarios, that's also a form of evidence for something else other than my argument. So I selected a particular historical case that I thought could isolate the role of acknowledgement, and that's why part of the reason I chose the Vietnam case and the covert operations in Laos is because, as I'll describe in a second, the degree of press coverage of those operations was so substantial and consistent that it's very hard to, I think, make the argument that people who wanted to know didn't know. If you wanted to know, you could definitely know as a member of the public and certainly as a government. And I bracket in the paper a bunch of other smaller debates in the IR literature about the role of Vietnam and things like counterinsurgency theory and the effectiveness of air power. I really want to zoom in and focus on the politics of this open secret intervention. So the specifics that I look at are the 1964 to 1968 period under the Johnson administration, when the U.S. had two basic forms of covert combat operations in Laos. This is not reconnaissance activity. It's not providing weapons to anyone. This is actually using military force. They were in the air referred to as Operation Barrel Roll, or later Operation Steel Tiger, and on the ground it was called Operation Shining Brass and Operation Prairie Fire. And what they were bombing missions in the air and cross-border ground raids that were meant to address a supply line that was running through almost the entire southern half of Laos, and allowing the North Vietnamese to funnel weapons supplies and people into South Vietnam to sustain and keep going the insurgency in South Vietnam. And an important feature of the case is that Laos was technically, its diplomatic status during the war was neutral. It was not involved in the war in Vietnam. It was to be treated, there was a multilateral agreement to treat Laos as a non-combatant. So that had an important effect actually on the kind of evidence I got to see. So as a result of this, the U.S. did not have a military advisory group in Laos to manage its military operations in Laos. They were instead managed by the State Department, because we could only have a diplomatic office in a country that was neutral. And 30, 40 years later, when they went and declassified these records, the U.S. government, through its standard declassification process, instead of using the very cautious rules that the CIA and the DoD use for any kind of covert operation, the State Department's declassification rules were used. And as a result, there are unusually candid documentary discussions of the covert operations in Laos, ones I didn't expect to see, and then when I sat down and read them, I realized, wow, this is because the State Department isn't as cautious about these things as the other two bureaucracies. So all the military strikes and cross-border raids were done by the DoD, but they were managed, much to the Department of Defense frustration at times, by the State Department, by the ambassador in Vientiane, the capital of Laos, and by the State Department and the White House back in Washington. So the reason I think this case is a particularly apt example of an open secret is a few different ways. In the paper, I review essentially the news coverage of Laos in the 1964 to 1968 period. This is an example on the far right of the kind of reports. Again, this was front page New York Times, just like the Israel case and the U.S. drones in Pakistan's case, where secrecy shrouds the move, but not very good secrecy, given that 30 heavily loaded jets attacked a supply line of the Viet Cong. This is very early in the war, this is 1965. But in the paper I describe how by 1966 and 1967, there was regular reporting on U.S. covert operations in Laos. The other reason I think it's an important case of this sort of phenomenon of open secrecy is there's good evidence from some of these records that the managers of this program anticipated and predicted there would be serious leaks about their operations in Laos, and yet they still engaged in them. So on the right here is a telegram from the embassy back to the State Department, in which the ambassador is saying that they anticipate, with these new B-52 raids inside Laos, continued press reports on the aerial bombardment in Laos, and that essentially that they found it increasingly unproductive to try to prevent publications of stories as long as they contain no allegations of official confirmation of those Laos operations. And a few years later, at the bottom here, you can see that as the operations evolved, there continued to be an assumption that leaks would take place. So to me, that indicates that these leaders understood that they weren't going to be fooling anyone if there was going to be New York Times articles reporting on these kinds of things. Just to give people an orientation geographically, these operations are taking place, as I said, in the southern half of Laos and the section that borders South Vietnam. The image on the right here is a summary of the aerial operations called Barrel Roll and Steel Tiger, in which strikes were taking place both in North Laos and in South Laos, southern Laos. These were the ones that were mostly focused on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply line into South Vietnam. These were more addressing the sort of nascent civil war that was going on inside Laos itself. And this is a sort of geographic scope of the cross-border ground operations of Shining Brass and Prairie Fire that were meant to, again, gather intelligence on and sever the supply line through Laos and into South Vietnam. The scope of this was no joking matter. This is one estimate of the number of sorties flown into Laos for various purposes here. You can see that the Air Force flew between 1964 and the end of 1967 some 73,000 flights that were categorized as strike, but notably there's also 64,000 flights that were categorized as other, totaling almost 150,000 just by the Air Force alone. in that 4-year period. So this was an enormously large program, and if you've seen, there's maps that have been created of the sort of scope of bombing within Laos, and it's really quite striking how many bombs were dropped in and geographically how large an area. So the kind of evidence that I go through in the paper that I think is relevant to the question of what is going on in this case of open secrecy, I put in 2 categories. One is discussions of the relationship between acknowledging the American role in Laos and the Chinese and Soviet reactions, and discussions of the relationship between that and the state of domestic politics within Laos. So first, some of the telegrams that are captured in these documents talk about the way that the acknowledgement or not that the United States takes of its operations in Laos is relevant to how the Soviets react. So in the first bullet point here, you see, again, the ambassador in Laos essentially talking about what he sees as a dilemma that the Soviets face, that if the United States officially acknowledged what it was doing in Laos, it would seriously restrict the Soviets' room for maneuver. It would eventually potentially force the Soviet Union to themselves, he says, come out foursquare for the Pathet Lao. That essentially says do what we're doing, but for their allies in Laos, and involve the Soviets far more deeply economically and militarily than even they wish. But as long as basically we avoid that acknowledgement process, if we don't get involved overtly, the Soviet Union is in a good position to sit back patiently and wait for the breaks to come its way, basically to act restrained. And part of the reason the ambassador knew that is because, not because he was reading the tea leaves so much as there was direct communication at this point during the war between some representatives from the Soviet Union and the United States. So this memorandum of conversation that summarizes the Secretary of State's dinner with the foreign minister, Soviet foreign minister in 1967, includes Soviet representatives essentially complaining that the U.S. was doing things too visibly, and that their ability to maintain a hands-off position in Laos was jeopardized the more the U.S. did things that was visible and the more the U.S. came close to acknowledging and having an overt role in Laos. So this was something that the Soviets themselves were articulating to the Americans. Now the other, I think, evidence that's relevant in terms of the Soviet and Chinese reactions, the communist reactions, gets more at the second escalation issue that I talked about, that communication and salient threshold idea. Here, this is an national intelligence estimate that was declassified, compiled by the Central Intelligence Agency and the other intelligence agencies in the U.S. government, which essentially entertains, this is written in 1970, and thinking and assessing what would happen if the U.S. did something overtly in Laos. And it essentially says that China has known that small amounts of Allied military units have been in Laos, Allied military units being a euphemism for the U.S. And what would happen if they crossed the political threshold of becoming overtly involved in Laos, it would be interpreted by the Chinese as an American willingness to be far more activist in the overall Indochina region. And it goes on to say that the likely reaction of the Chinese would to sort of reply in kind and to become more involved with their own units in Laos in order to express to the U.S. that they're very concerned about what the U.S. is doing. So they assumed there would be a ratcheting effect if the U.S. Transitioned from being covert to overt in Laos, and draw on this basic idea, this kind of threshold idea that the Chinese had essentially become comfortable with the U.S. having a limited and covert role in Laos, but kind of transgressing that threshold would be seen in China as a sort of bellwether of the larger political goals of the U.S. Now, the other escalation scenario the U.S. worried about and was relevant to the sort of scope of the war was the effect that acknowledgement of the U.S. of its covert operations in Laos would have on domestic politics. And the basic idea was that the leader of Laos, the Premier Suvarna, had a very fragile hold on power, and his primary claim for holding on to power as a sort of neutral arbiter between warring sides was that he embodied and embraced and would defend Laos's neutrality, its status as a neutral country, and not get it drawn into a war on its neighbor, sort of on its border. And basically what the evidence that I've seen indicates is that the U.S. believed that it could either do acknowledged overt military operations without Suvarna's blessing and would cause him to lose power, or they could do it with his blessing, and it would essentially, A, jeopardize his power, and B, likely invite a larger civil war within his territory. So essentially, acknowledgement would affect through domestic politics the scope of the war. leading either to a regime change or drawing in American troops into a civil war that they wanted to stay out of. So there's some pretty explicit discussions here where essentially the ambassador in Laos is saying, well, we've seen the leaks that have taken place in the American media, but we think that Savannah can withstand that as long as the U.S. continues to refuse to admit what we're doing. That if we do admit what we're doing in Laos, it will make him essentially have to buckle and react, and that will potentially jeopardize the programs that they're undertaking, as well as the ability to avoid him from him losing power. Okay, so stepping back, what I think this shows is that the American government at the time valued the unacknowledged status of its operations in Laos, even though they were reported on quite regularly, and that was linked to their desire to try to keep the Vietnam War contained and limited to the territory of Vietnam itself. I think overall, looking into these kind of open secrets and the implications of this particular project is it helps us understand and provide some guidance to those who might anticipate exposure of their own covert operations in sort of a contemporary policy situation. And it also provides some ideas about how to understand how others will react to the exposure of their activity. So thinking about how is Putin or Russia going to react if there's reporting on what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, this sort of historical parallel, I think, sheds light on what Russia might be thinking when they say, oh, no, no, we're not involved, we're not involved. When they refuse to admit it, it might be a face-saving gesture both to Europe and a way for the Russians to back out of there if they want to later down the road. In terms of future research, I think there's a lot of work that can be done by IR scholars collecting data on the process of leaks and the number of leaks, theorizing the larger leak process. Why do these leaks happen in the first place, which is something I don't talk about very much in the paper, although I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. Thinking about other reasons acknowledgement or non-acknowledgement can be politically useful than the one I talk about. And thinking rather than just one country's choice to acknowledge or not, thinking about the more collective process, sort of along the lines of the emperor's new clothes scenario, where you've got not just the emperor, but all those around the emperor choosing not to acknowledge what they can all see and know. So with that, hopefully that created some questions. I'm looking forward to hear what people say, and thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Field your own questions.
Okay.
And
You get to go first?
jump in first if you don't mind.
Sure, it's your show.
First of all, great talk. Refreshingly straightforward, clear, well organized. Thank you. There seems to be an implicit takeaway from your talk, which is basically open secrets haven't really changed much over time. That there's a sameness today versus then, and we can just apply lessons from then to today. And then there's also kind of an implicit, when you make comparisons to Israel, open secrets are kind of the same across, you know, cases. So they're, and so I guess I push you a little bit on that. One is, I'm wondering, I mean, you mentioned those, you know, over 100,000 flights.
Yeah.
Yet you could still have an open secret rather than just open. And today, I think it would be virtually impossible to have such a huge open secret. It would just be open. It would be impossible to deny. So the world has changed in terms of just the level of monitoring, surveilling, awareness. So maybe this is a globalization story, I don't know. And then second of all, in terms of types of open secrets, it seems like in the Laos case, there's really no upside to an open secret. They would prefer a closed secret, but they got an open secret which is better than open. However, the Israel case, which you opened with as kind of an interesting comparison analogy, to me, their open secret is the best of both worlds. It is, if it's a secret, there's no deterrent. Who the heck wants a secret, totally secret, after you already have the bomb, of course. But if you don't have the bomb yet, then of course you want to keep it secret because if you're developing, because you might get bombed before you get it. But once you have the bomb, you kind of, but then they get the benefit of it being a secret too, because they can say no. And so would you agree that there's a fundamental difference between these types of open?
So to take them in reverse order, I would agree that there is a conceptual difference that there are two different kinds of situations where basically an open secret is your optimal policy choice and it's better than a closed secret versus situations where an open secret is just like the best you can do given the constraints, and a closed secret would be ideal. I don't necessarily agree that Laos is a case where a closed secret was clearly the preferable option. So I actually think there was a deterrent value to having some leaks about this program. And I don't integrate this into the paper because I kind of don't want to talk about this half of it, although I think there's a really interesting story to talk about open secrets as deterrent tools. But I did find a quote in passing where basically Secretary of State says, we're getting a lot of heat in Congress for treating Laos as a sanctuary. And they were. A lot of military leaders encouraged this and talked to members of Congress because they felt that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was this basically unperturbed, only covertly bombed and barely at all interdicted on the ground. And they said, well, but these leaks are helpful in the sense that it lets people know that we're doing something. And so that to me suggested that there was actually, part of the reason they stopped trying to crack down on the stories was because they said there's some political utility to having leaks about it. So that's more a domestic politics story than like the Israeli deterrent kind of story that you're talking, which is more about an interstate value for open secrecy. But I think the point that you're making is right, and I think that that I might, I think I might need to kind of account for that in the paper and say that, in some ways this the Laos case was a situation where there were some upsides to having it being an open secret. But there was no upside to acknowledging that open secret. I think that's the key test of the claims that I'm trying to make in the article. But I think you're right. That in the case of the Israeli nuclear arsenal, it's kind of a Goldilocks situation. They can have their cake and eat it too. They can have the deterrent value of having knowledge about it, but at the same time they can avoid some of the formal penalties and maybe some of the reactor proliferation that would happen if they were open about it and rubbed people's faces in it. In terms of like open secrets, do they change over time? Is it feasible to have something on the scale that happened in Laos now? I would say yes and no. So first of all, I think the drone strike operations in Pakistan were pretty intense, and there was a lot going on there. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but that was a pretty substantial organized military operations program. So I think that. That to me suggests that even when Twitter's around, and even with social media, you can sustain a pretty large volume. Now at the same time, you have the raid of bin Laden in Abbottabad that was live tweeted, and that I think is something that just could not have happened 30 years ago, where an average citizen was able to broadcast to the world in real time a covert operation. So I think there are limits, and I think probably the time between acting and having it being exposed has been shortened, and maybe the scope of what you can do has been contracted. Although again, I think the drone example suggests it hasn't been winnowed down to like just one-off small things. But I think it's definitely something I could talk about a bit more clearly at the end of the paper. Is how have technological changes, information technology changes, altered the way that these open secrets come about, how fast they come about, and the depth of them. All right, go for it, Jeff.
Well, great talk, Austin. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask two questions.
Okay.
So one is on mechanisms.
Okay.
It struck me that the first one that you proposed, sort of avoiding the felt need to respond, seems very plausible to me.
Okay.
The second one I'm less compelled, less convinced of, let's put it that way. And the example you gave had to do with Israel. It seemed to me that example and all the other ones that I can think of could be just as well explained by the first mechanism without the second one.
Okay.
So can you point to an example where you would actually need the second one where the first one wasn't sufficiently robust? And the second question is sort of a variant of the so what question, which is, suppose I buy your whole story here. You start out up front with sort of the motivation of saying, like, look, so some of the kind of input assumptions in IR theory, don't match this, and I see that, and I think there's some validity to it. But assumptions are always flawed in various ways. Can you think about, what does this mean for the conclusions of scholarly work? Like, where can we look at a, scholar X's explanation of war in Iraq or the War of 1812 or whatever it is wrong because they're not getting this key component that you're pointing to? How does this cash out for us in terms of changing our perspective?
Okay, good. All right, so so the first one, how dependent is the second mechanism on the first? How dependent is the communication process dependent on this sort of face-saving story, and what independent work does it do? I think that's a fair question, and I think that it would be hard for me to point to an example where they're both not simultaneously operating, because I think the act of respecting an adversary's face, the act of engaging in social tact in an everyday setting, is one that both simultaneously has an effect on your level of humiliation or embarrassment, or your opponent's level of humiliation and embarrassment, and can be seen as an indicator, a sort of informative, effortful attempt to respect and avoid the humiliation of the other side. So I think it's...
Can I give you an example?
Yeah, go
where
ahead.
I think there's just the first and not the second one?
Where there's just the first and not the second.
So here, I have an example.
Okay, go ahead.
So the example is in the Clinton administration with the Rwanda massacre.
Yeah.
Where the Clinton administration more or less said there are acts of genocide going on, but they didn't want to say this is a genocide because it had legal implications. It had consequences, and that would there would be a felt need to respond to that. Right. And so they just denied it. But there's no plausible story, in my view, that they were trying to communicate with the Hutus what they were doing or not. I mean, the second mechanism just isn't there. It isn't present, whereas the first mechanism is. So I think the story is much more compelling.
Okay. I mean, I think that's, I think I'll take that as a suggestion to potentially simplify the story. I think instead of thinking about the Hutus in the case that you're talking about with Rwanda, there may have been a communicative effect on other actors who were thinking about intervening. And in effect, basically at UN sort of multilateral diplomacy level, where the European governments may have been calibrating and saying, okay, is the US calling it a genocide or not? That's really a sort of observable sort of lens into their level of political willingness to become involved. And it becomes a sort of symbolic litmus test is whether or not you use that language. So I think, just because I can tell that story doesn't mean I need to. So I think your point stands, which is that.
That's the first mechanism in my mind. That's the felt need to respond, and the Europeans respond, checking on that, but that's.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, and then on the second one, how does changing these assumptions cash out on big conclusions? Okay, so I think there's sort of two main ones. So there are the two that I can think of off the top of my head. The first one is that I think that one of the things I want to do is break apart this dichotomous, choosing between public and private. If you start to look at these intermediate type outcomes, and I think open secrecy, these types of open secrets are one of those intermediate outcomes, you start to change the story and expectations about how signaling dynamics and communication dynamics and acting in conflicts would cash out. So if you're thinking that states have to either publicly signal or privately signal, and you're not considering the intermediate options, then you're not going to consider, you're going to mispredict what the United States might try to do in a conflict like Vietnam, where as I was saying to Peter, I think there was some value in their covert operations in Laos and other covert operations they were doing. They knew that those were intermediate between public and private, and that those could have a deterrent value, and yet they also had benefits because they were not public, they were open secrets, they weren't acknowledged. They have this other side benefit. So I think that's one example where we're missing the tool, like we're sort of having a mistake in terms of what we expect the different tools of coercion might be selected. That's one example there. The other way I think it cashes out is I think that and I guess this would be related, is that I think we would over-predict the degree of public action if we don't account for the possibility of open secret type action. So if we only have this sort of dichotomous choice we think states are choosing between, I think a less sort of great, sort of graduated set of policy tools, then we're going to have expectations in the aggregate that I think are going to be sort of at odds with what we're missing. And then I think maybe a third one, just to throw one more in there, is I think there is a sort of distinct communication game going on here. And so my other work has looked at some of that communication game going on at the covert level. And I think that looking at the way these open secrets allow different kinds of communication, both communication in terms of limited war and potentially communication in terms of resolve, that's its own sort of like communication dynamic that I think we should try to understand if that's has empirical purchase in an important case like the Vietnam War. So that's how I think that would cash out. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sure. Back.
So in the beginning, you talked about why this like open secret matters, and you mentioned as a current example like alternative facts. But I think that alternative facts is like more of a question between like truth or false, rather than secret or non-secret. So I was could you talk more about how open secrets and your research may be relevant to like alternative facts?
Yeah, that's good, and I think it begs the question of what exactly is an alternative fact, which I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we have a good definition of what it is yet. But I think the main reason I drew that analogy is because I see a lot of similarities between. So there was the credibility gap, or the credibility problem, was a kind of phrase that was used a lot during the Vietnam War for both the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration. And Laos had a lot to do with the credibility gap. What it was a sort of increasing divergence between what was being publicly reported that the U.S. was doing in Vietnam generally, and in particular in Laos, and what the official government position was about that. And that played a huge role in Johnson's decision not to run for re-election, and it played a big role in how the Nixon administration handled some of the policies they engaged in later in the war. And I see a pretty clear similarity between that and the frustration people have with these alternative facts that the Trump administration has been touting, an increasing gap between what is kind of publicly observable and relatively verifiable in terms of, say, crowd size up to inauguration, and what they kind of stick to in terms of their language, which is an alternative interpretation. So I think there is like fiction in the official discourse of the White House and facts that are observable to everyone, and that is a pretty similar scenario, even though maybe alternative facts are like completely fabricated versus like the language surrounding these open secrets is less nakedly misleading or something. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how I would split the difference, but I think the key sort of theoretical and sort of normative implication is that these are alternative sort of linguistic tactics that the White House can use, which are at odds with everything, with something that everyone can observe. And that's where I see the parallels between these situations, and I think is worth thinking about, although I take your point that it might be a little bit different with alternative facts. Okay, how about over here?
Yeah, so it seems like you've sort of positioned this as sort of a defensive capability, and that you lessen the pressure on your adversary to escalate. Could it equally be seen as almost an offensive capability in that if the adversary were to try and escalate, there's far less international legitimacy behind that sort of response? Even just an example that comes to mind is if China, for instance, does not actively acknowledge militarization in the South China Sea, that weakens the ability of the United States to militarize forcefully against islands there. So could it be seen as sort of an offensive maneuver against an adversary rather than just a tactful defense?
Yeah, I think that there's, I think it could be kind of paired with a variety of foreign policy goals that you could tactfully avoid acknowledging what you're doing in pursuit of a defensive goal, or you could tactfully not acknowledge what you're doing in terms of trying to revise the status quo. So yeah, I think your example with China not calling what it's doing in terms of like creating these islands and putting military bases on them, let's say, not acknowledging what's going on there is paired with a sort of geostrategic goal to increase their, relative power within East Asia and their ability to project certain forms of military power there. But at the same time, I think it can be paired with, so I still think that there's an escalation story that applies to both of those goals. Like China would like to revise the status quo, but not, hand the United States a gift to escalate the conflict overall and, retaliate against the Chinese with a lot of international legitimacy. So I think what I try to do, and I kind of skipped over the slide in the interest of time, but what I try to do is, theorize the escalation control portion of the process and keep that sort of unconnected from a particular policy goal that states are are using these sort of open secret covert actions to achieve. And I do that same thing in the book where I sort of say, I don't want to marry my own argument to sort of unnecessarily to a particular kind of goal. I think the goal in the case of the United States was mostly defensive, but I think you're right that it could be used for offensive. And maybe Russia, it'd be interesting to think through what we thought about Russia's activity in the Ukraine. That's pretty revisionist offensive action, but I still think fundamentally their refusal to admit what they're doing there is to avoid the Europeans and the Americans feeling the need to and acting on potentially changing their mind about how they're going to react and retaliate against them. And that's, both to allow them to nibble away and change the status quo, but also to avoid a larger war. So trying to separate those two is, I think, a little tricky, but I think the sort of escalation story gains purchase in either of those scenarios, is what I would say. Cool. Hi.
Hi, Austin. Very interesting talk, so thank you.
Thanks.
So one of the things that I was thinking while you were giving the talk that I would like to hear a bit more about, and something I didn't see in the paper, was hypocrisy. So when I think of why you wouldn't, how you would react to the leak of some secret, the first thing I tend to think of the Farrell and Fenimore piece in 2013, and that there are costs in looking hypocritical, and that hypocrisy plays an interesting role in how we navigate whether or not a state fesses up to something or doesn't. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And part of that relies on the time horizon. So it wasn't clear to me how long an open secret needed to stay an open secret to be classified as an open secret. So at some point, drone secrets are out, right?
Yeah.
And at some point, the U.S. says, all right, yes. And then you see all of these different NGO groups try to calculate civilian casualty statistics in ways that forces the hand of the U.S. to acknowledge a program, right? So I'm wondering how long do you have to stay open to be open? And then the last question was a bit more of a conceptual one. I wondered if your audience mattered here. So should we conceptually think of the role of open secrets between states differently than a state to its people? So I don't study authoritarian regimes. My hunch is that if I did, there would be lots of open secrets, where everyone in society would know something was true that the state wouldn't acknowledge.
Yeah.
But everyone knows it's true. But is that dynamic any different than a state engaging in this? Yeah.
Sure. These are great. Thank you. Okay, in terms of hypocrisy, I think I would consider that essentially an alternative explanation, where the desire to avoid looking hypocritical, say violating international law, violating the neutrality of Laos in the case that I'm looking at here, that the desire to avoid expressly doing that is an explanation for why you don't acknowledge what has become exposed. And so, I think that when I look in the evidence, and I think it's just something you gotta separate out, see what the evidence supports. And I think in the case that I'm looking at here, and some of the examples that I'm drawing on here, it's less it's less a question of hypocrisy and more a question of the strategic implications of admitting a violation of the rule. So I think
Don't those walk hand in hand?
maybe they do, to the extent that hypocrisy is part of the action-reaction spiral cycle. Then maybe I subsume the Farrell and Fenimore story. But to me, my reading of their story about what the implications of leaks are and how it affects sort of unipolarity and the American legitimacy of the American international order, it had a less, it wasn't so much about sort of escalation of a concrete crisis. It was more about an erosion of the legitimacy of that international order and an exposure of the degree to which the U.S. violates its own rules, and that's dangerous in the aggregate over time for sort of overall order sort of things. So I think hypocrisy could play a role in both, but I think for their piece, I would think it's more fair to treat that as an actual alternative explanation. And I just think in this case, the evidence is pretty decisively in favor of a story that's about sort of this specific crisis and the escalation of that. How long does it have to be exposed for it to be an open secret? Yeah, so I kind of fudge this a little in terms of like how I code things. Like I essentially choose a case where it's like been exposed enough and with enough detail and for long enough that it's, to me, like an obvious case of an open secret. But like where I would mark that particular transition point would be a little tricky. And I think if I built a data set, for example, I'd have to be a lot less sloppy and, and hand-wavy about this. So I think, in terms of sort of future research, I need to be very clear about what open secrecy is in this project, and I need to make the case that this case is one. But I think I need to, I would have to be a lot more systematic about it. And I think I actually don't think that the time issue is as concerning to me as kind of placing it in terms of scope and level of detail. Like, I think you could have a story that breaks a story, a single story that has a lot of detail and is in the front page of the Washington Post or something like that, and that's just like overnight, it becomes an open secret, let's say. So it's not like it has to like season for like a year or something like that necessarily. But I do think that kind of getting more clear about how to code those is something that you fairly are, fairly pushing back on. And then do audiences matter? I think absolutely. I think there's an interesting parallel between sort of the way personalist dictatorships keep the aura of power. My own colleague, Lisa Wedeen, I think she has talked a little bit about this in the context of Syria from her sort of earlier research. And there is a sense in which part of the politics of authoritarian, maintaining legitimacy of authoritarian rule is deterring people from admitting what everyone knows. And there's been some work in terms of like the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe about sort of like an emperor's new clothes story, where once everybody got in a public square and said, oh, this autocratic leader is full of what, then everybody sort of felt like the taboo had been broken, and then that's why you see a quick crumbling of power. So I think audience does matter, and I think if in future research or in other projects, taking this acknowledgement versus knowledge distinction, it could be really fruitful for understanding the management of legitimacy, the management of domestic actors. So I think that's like a cool thing that I would love to see in the future. But for this project, I think the sort of the audience being adversaries and maybe the local partner you're working with makes a lot of sense for this particular context. Great. I'll just keep working back this way. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering, isn't this a story that's more about acknowledgement than about secrecy?
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's not about like who knows what and how much and the level of detail and so on, but it's more like what's acknowledged and what's not acknowledged. And there's like a huge gray area between like acknowledgement and not acknowledgement. Like the drone war. Everyone, like even the US, acknowledges that there is something is happening, but just not saying exactly how much, and to whom or like where it's applied to and whatever. But it does acknowledge something, right? So the variation here is like not so much on the secrecy side, but more on the acknowledgement side. So would you would this kind of change the story a little bit?
I don't think it changes the story. I think that's exactly the story I want to tell, is that this is not a question of who knows how much about what. And I think the reason I like the Laos case is because I can make, I think, a compelling case that everyone who cared to know could know as much as they want, or as much as they needed to know about the core question of, is the US engaged in active military operations in Laos? Absolutely. But the question is so you're right that what I'm interested in is whether something is acknowledged or not. And you're also right that you could talk about acknowledgement in terms of is government A doing something versus what is government A doing in particular places within Laos. So you could have a government that acknowledges, yes, we are doing something in Laos, but we're not doing these kinds of things. And that's actually the longer story about what the US was doing. Is actually the US acknowledged it was doing something in Laos, but it only acknowledged it was doing reconnaissance. So this, when you read the cables, it's hilarious. What they say is, there's going to be leaks about these bombing operations. What we need to say is, when the reporter says, what are you doing in Laos? Basically, they say the press guidance is, we say we are doing armed reconnaissance at the request of the Laotian government, and that may explain what happened. But anything else, basically we neither confirm nor deny. That was the line that they negotiated, but and established and coordinated. And so they had this excuse of, yes, American planes are over Laos. And the reason they came up with this is because there was early on in late 1964, a plane was shot down. And so they had to explain why an American plane capable of bombing was shot down. So they had to have some kind of story. But they said it was armed reconnaissance, which, not coincidentally, did not violate the terms of Laotian neutrality. It was at their request, and it was not military operations. So that is an example of how the US was acknowledging its role. It was a bit more detailed than I got into here, but it was not acknowledging military operations. So the key, I think, for me, theoretically, is to show that acknowledging the other stuff the US was doing was something that was specifically linked to escalation problems. And that's what the US thought was, if they acknowledged actual military operations, kinetic operations that killed people. That's what would cause the Soviets to react differently. That's what would endanger the Suvana, the local leaders' hold on power. And so I should, I need to be very specific. It's about acknowledgement of American military operations in Laos. Go ahead.
I mean, variation then seems to me to be on the acknowledgement side, right? That's like your IV, right?
Yeah.
And DV is then like escalation or non-escalation. Do you see like then a change in behavior when the level of acknowledgement changes? So before Americans did not acknowledge anything,
right?
Then they acknowledge a little bit.
Right.
This is kind of changed the behavior then of the Russians in terms of escalation. Did they also do? I mean.
That's a great. I mean, that would be. I don't do that in this paper. I think that would be a cool way to get within case variation, and frame it as having a corresponding change in actions. Now, I would flip the IV and the DV. To be honest, I think the dependent variable is forms of acknowledgement and variation in acknowledgement, and the independent variable is escalation dangers. That's the way I kind of think of it. But your point applies, which is that you could look at differences in acknowledgement either as an IV or a DV, and look at corresponding differences in either escalation risks or sort of behavior on the other side related to escalation. And that will be a further way to push this. So one revision I'm thinking about doing is looking at the Nixon administration. They do an overt incursion into Cambodia in 1971, I think it was. And part of the reason they did that is because they valued symbolically crossing that threshold. Because by that point in the war, they were desperate to get the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table and to make compromises. And they thought if they did crazy stuff, like mine harbors that had never been mined before, or overtly get involved in a neutral country bordering Vietnam. I mean, this is Nixon and Kissinger, so they're a little risk acceptant in a way that other leaders weren't. But I have a story to tell where essentially escalation dangers turned from something that the American leaders feared to something they valued as a coercive tool. And then that corresponds with them engaging in far more acknowledged American combat operations in a neutral country. It's not Laos, it's Cambodia. But I try to, so that's something I'm playing with as like, not a full-on case, but something I can talk about in the conclusion as like, this also has implications for variation over time. So it appears we're thinking along the same lines. But thanks. Okay. Sorry, I've taken a while to get to. Go ahead.
One thing I wonder about is the military, which generally considers a secret,
Mm-hmm.
and the subtle distinction between an open secret and
right.
a real secret just passes right over the heads of most military officers.
Right.
In Vietnam, you had this conflict going on in Laos, which was something people kind of were guessing at, but probably many of the troops on the ground, it was actually a bigger secret than it was to readers of the New York Times. So I think there's always a problem when the military is trying to keep something secret
mm-hmm.
or keep it even from their own troops.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yet the government may be allowing an open secret to spread,
right.
or
right.
the press may be actively trying to find out what's
right.
going on.
Right.
And it generates a level of distrust on the part of the military, which we suffered from for years,
mm-hmm.
so that the military often is in total distrust of the press and a certain amount of distrust of its own civilian government, which is a frightening concept. But I think in Vietnam that really got completely out of control, where people really worked very hard. I mean, you're probably not even aware how hard
mm-hmm.
people have worked to carry on operations in Laos without making that obvious.
Right, right.
And yet it would be appearing in the paper anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, people have been denied decorations for decades because the military still keeps a lot of this secret. The military's upset over the treatment of the Hmong. I mean, getting the Hmong repatriated to America
right.
was held back by the fact that this is supposedly an open secret. It wasn't
yeah.
open enough for the Hmong.
Yeah. No, I think, first of all, the couple of implications that you're talking about in terms of decorations denied because it wasn't acknowledged, repatriation of local actors that we worked with in those military operations, and the contrast to South Vietnamese groups who were allowed to immigrate. I think that's great. I think that's really interesting. I think it's something I want to look into as a future implication, there's a lot of really nasty side effects of this open secret situation. When you have a refusal to acknowledge, so one example that's a little bit different is that this is something that NGOs got really frustrated about during the drone program, was that the U.S.'s inability to acknowledge it meant that there was a real handicapped debate, a really warped debate that was happening, where the White House can't actually be honest about what it's doing and can't testify in Congress. They have to be all very vague about that. And that means that even though there was a lot of information about the program, there couldn't be the normal deliberative dialogue that would happen around a program. The same thing is a critique that's been levied against the Israeli government in not acknowledging its nuclear arsenal, is they can't have a normal discussion about force level, force posture, what's our use policy and different kinds of nuclear potential nuclear scenarios. But I think that you're completely right that non-acknowledgement has these downstream effects, ones that certainly weren't anticipated. It's not like they were thinking of the Hmong when they were coming up with this policy. But it is certainly something that contributes to the military's frustration. And I think that's a consistent theme in this story, from the restrictions. They would give kilometer restrictions to how far the cross-border raids could go. 10 kilometers, okay, maybe 15 kilometers, okay, maybe 20 kilometers. Every one of those intervals, you have the special operations commanders saying, let us go a little further, let us do a little bit more. And so there's that frustration, and then there's the frustration between the honesty that's created by a lack of honesty and things like the repatriation. So I think I completely agree. All of that is part of the story, and part of the implications of this practice, which is one I don't talk about in this paper, but is one that I think is really important to taking a kind of a full assessment of whether or not this is a good idea, basically, over time. Yeah, Nick?
Thanks, this was really fascinating. A couple questions. First is, what does this have to do with the audience cost literature? I mean, you seem to pretty much assume that leaders are strongly affected by domestic opinion, and that opinion tends to kind of be hawkish, or at least that other people perceive that other people's domestic audiences are like that. So I wonder how you relate it to that literature, especially since there's a lot of recent work that says audience costs maybe aren't as strong as we think they are.
Right.
Second, just an interesting thing about the Israel nuclear case is that it's not just Israel versus the Arab states, right? I mean, it's strongly conditioned by a third party, in the U.S. Really wanting Israel to keep it secret.
Right.
And the U.S. had the exact same reasons for wanting to keep it secret that you highlight in your work. It's interesting that it was a third party coming in, and it's not clear what Israel would have done absent that, right? I mean, if the U.S. hadn't been so strong on that issue, would Israel have kept it a secret? I don't think we really know the answer to that.
Right.
And then I guess you kind of touched on this a little bit in some of your answers, but why is there acknowledgement in some cases and not others that kind of superficially seem like they're similar scenarios? So in the nuclear realm, right, India, Pakistan eventually acknowledged they had nuclear weapons. North Korea has. South Africa did not. Israel has not. And why do you see that sort of variation? And I think you could ask the same question about U.S. military interventions. It seems like the logic that you lay out should be compelling in all of these cases.
It basically
so,
predicts uniformity rather than
so
variation.
How do you, explain those differences?
It's great. Okay, so what does it have to do with the audience cost literature? Do I assume? Yeah. So I think. I think I have sort of a weak assumption that's consistent with an audience cost perspective, that leaders at least fear they or their adversaries can be put in a position where hawkish or defend our reputation, defend our honor type audiences would constrain them. Now, I would agree with the transition in the audience cost literature from associating audiences with domestic publics to thinking more carefully about elite domestic audiences. So I think the U.S., for example, when it's thinking about Soviet reactions, is thinking about the more hardline members of the Politburo. They're not thinking about people out in the streets. And so I think even though in one sense the literature has evolved to say that audience costs are less strong than we think, but in another way the literature has evolved to say audience costs are just a broader category of actors, and those actors sometimes have preferences that are going to make a leader kind of not want to back down when they might want to strategically. So I think it would be sort of a weak assumption. I would try to say that it's a weak assumption, not one that assumes a strong model of audience costs. But I think it's there. And at least for that first mechanism in terms of being forced to respond. In terms of the communication story, you know, whether or not I ditch it given Jeff's suggestions, but if I keep it, that one doesn't really have, like you could have no audiences. That actually is just like two leaders trying to say, okay, I'm not gonna punch you below the belt. Are you gonna punch me below the belt? And there it doesn't have to, there is no sort of forced need to respond. It's really just two actors trying to understand, do you want limited war or not? That's sort of the showing story there. So that's not as dependent, I think, on the audience cost story. Third parties, I think, can have the same escalation concerns. I think you're right. Part of the origins of this project, way back when I was a grad student, was thinking about not Israel, but U.S. preferences for non-disclosure. And as you know, I have like some work that's looked at the sort of way the U.S. managed information about different kinds of programs in different situations during the Cold War. But the particular issue of acknowledgement, yes, I think that's something that a third-party actor, under certain circumstances, I think maybe less common than the actual actor itself who created the secret. That's a third-party actor can share the same kind of concern about hard-to-control escalation, forced replies by an adversary. And yeah, I think it's a great question what Israel would have done if they didn't have to basically bargain with the U.S. about their arsenal. Would they have arrived at this conclusion? I mean, I've presented this other places and read enough things that say that Israel gets a lot out of non-disclosure itself. And so, you know, it may have been, its origins may have been in a compromise with its kind of great power patron, but it certainly, I think, has reasons to sustain that. And that's part of the reason it's been so enduring, despite big changes in in politics in the region and globally. Lastly, why acknowledge or not, and is my theory so sort of strongly intuitive in terms of states don't want escalation, so wouldn't they always want to not acknowledge? And yeah, so I think you know, my answer earlier, which was essentially that escalation can flip for leaders from something to be avoided to something to invite as a coercive tool, I think that's the explanation for when you're going to get that variation. You're going to see you're going to see acknowledgement in the case of North Korea, because North Korea, in some senses, wants its nuclear arsenal to scare the hell out of people, wants to be brazen and bold because that's part of what's going to deter other countries from regime change. India, Pakistan, I'm not quite as sure about how the story I would tell there. I see more similarity in the non-acknowledgement phase, where both of them did not want the other one to feel forced to respond, so they settled on this, like, we're going to quietly develop our weapons from like 75 to 98. So the test and on, I'm not sure how I would make sense of that in escalation. But, you know, the tough question for the theory then, if the story is when escalation flips from a liability to an asset, is what are the conditions under which that happens? And so let's go one more step back in the IV chain. So my story there in Vietnam would simply be, this is the end of the war, the US wants to get the hell out. And that was not the case in 64 to 68. And so the Tet Offensive was this huge pivotal moment where Nixon and Kissinger were in extract mode. And when you're in extract mode, for them at least, they were at a strategic disadvantage. Everyone knew they wanted to get out. So the only way for them to build coercive leverage was through crazy stuff like raise escalation risks. And so, you know, I could translate that into, you know, you're going to see non-acknowledgement and escalation caution early in wars, in the middle parts of wars, but then when you're in war termination phase, you're likely to see acknowledgement, I guess, would be one story. I don't know if it actually cashes out, but that would be the story. Okay, yeah.
It's really interesting. One part of it that I'm not clear on is, is when does the acknowledgement, the decision to acknowledge or not, how much is that the result of mutual communication, right? And how much is that just a unilateral decision based on intelligence assessment of the other side? I mean, there could be a mutual agreement that we're both not going to broadcast something. And I think been working on the drone issue, and in the Pakistan case, right, that was a mutual agreement between the US and Pakistan to engage in plausible deniability.
Right.
And so it was totally understood on both sides that neither side would claim this was going on.
Right.
And so that's a kind of a different, seems to me a different dynamic than the documents that you're citing where it's US and officials saying, well, if we go across this line, you know, we might expect, negative pressure on Savannah or whatever.
Right. So
it's the mutual, right? The communication.
I think I think you could reframe my evidence. I think you could reread my evidence with that idea in mind and tell cooperative stories about both piles of evidence that I have. First of all, I think remember I did have the quote from the Soviets, where the Soviets are basically requesting that the U.S. not acknowledge and engage in visible operations in Laos. Keep those more like you were doing in 64, 65, not as brazen as they've been lately. So that suggests an explicit level of mutual interest, that the U.S. perception, do we acknowledge or not, and when they debate that, was informed by an awareness of what the Soviets sort of had a mutual interest in this.
That's very explicit, but a lot of it must be tacit, right?
Yeah.
There must be variations in how tacit or how explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Suvana story, it was explicitly negotiated too. Like basically Suvana was like, yeah, don't tell me what you're doing on the one hand, and number two, don't admit it when it becomes reported on. And that was something he valued, and the ambassador was constantly talking to Suvana about what he would tolerate, and non-acknowledgement was a key part of that, basically a bargain, very similar to Pakistan, where the local client said, you can do more than we're saying publicly as long as you don't admit it, and we'll allow you to do that. So, but I do think at times these are more implicit bargains, where I think the U.S. didn't coordinate. For example, to return to the Israel example, the Arab governments also did not acknowledge the Israeli nuclear capability even after the leaks for years, in the 70s and the 80s. I think they kind of started doing it in the 90s. For a little while, I thought I might try to code this, but that project didn't get off the ground. But there was a time there where the Arab states, the United States, and Israel were all not acknowledging, not talking publicly about the Israeli capability that was being reported in the media. And I don't think, the U.S. went to Egypt and said, let's go ahead and do this. I think it was the U.S. and Israel believed the Arab states would have an interest in this, and the Arab states saw that the U.S. and Israel were pretending it wasn't happening, and they kind of got on board, and it was much more tacit. So I think, in terms of the paper, do you think that I should make that tacit or explicit, but that sort of interactive component clearer as both part of the mechanism and as a scope condition, where if it doesn't exist, okay.
Collective social construction.
Right, yeah, it is, it really is. Okay, that's great, thanks.
Time for one more question.
Thank you. Again, thank you for your talk. Have you looked at all into the notion of applying open secrets to deception programs? For example, deliberately creating false open secrets.
Brain exploded.
Unproductive and expensive for your adversary against a threat that doesn't actually exist. Deviating him from escalating in a direction
That's very
like
clever.
more productive.
Yeah, that's very clever. I think that's I had not thought of that. But once.
The advantage is that you can't be called a liar when it's discovered your open secret isn't actually true because you haven't acknowledged it.
No, it's true. I think so. Let me just try to think if there's an example of that. Do you have an example in mind?
Well, I don't know if
Yeah.
it was a false open secret, but the triggering of the Soviet Union into massive expenditure in different directions.
Right.
Claiming the workability of Star Wars,
So okay. So you intentionally allow a misleadingly optimistic report about missile defense technology to leak, even though it's not true.
And you don't acknowledge it, thereby giving it credence.
Yeah, okay, so it looks like you're really pissed. Why did it leak, dang it?
It may have been a plot of the show The Americans. I don't know if you watch the show.
I do, it is awesome.
I
yes.
think there's something about the Star Wars
I don't watch TV.
Well, I will rewatch the series with this question in mind. But no, I think I think that's a really interesting idea, and I will. I'll look into it. And definitely keep an open mind about potentially this going on. I mean, I'm definitely looking at a case here where there were covert operations going on for sure in Laos. So this is a case of a true open secret.
They were true.
Yeah.
I'm talking about.
No, I know. Alternatives. Yeah, that's great.
Business card afterwards.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
We're out of
thank
time.
you. That was awesome. Thanks.